Hello and welcome to Sunday Bible Chat for the 33rd Sunday in Ordinary Time, which happens to be November 18th, which happens to be the Sunday before the Feast of Christ the King, which happens to be the Sunday before the beginning of Advent, which happens to be the beginning of the new liturgical year and an end to the old. And as the liturgical seasons are shifting, so we are reading more and more texts which have an apocalyptic kind of background. Lots of signs in the skies of disasters to come, promises of redemption for the wise who are going to shine brightly as the stars in the firmament, or for those who look to the clouds and see the Son of Man appearing there. But basically the imagery is quite terrifying, suggesting almost that the end of the world is at hand. And so as we read these texts, they're not very comforting really, especially if we're familiar with images of nuclear war, and especially if we have seen images of what happened to Nagasaki and Hiroshima, especially if we now know that contemporary warheads are multiple times more powerful than the ones that leveled those two cities, and that some of the weaponry existing in the world today could actually not only wipe out whole cities, but could do continental damage and leave radiation problems that last for a millennium at least. So we have in our hands the potential to wipe out humanity as we know it. It's pretty scary. And then, of course, as we look at the signs of the times, there have been so many natural catastrophes as well, in addition to random acts of violence and warfare. So wherever we look, there is trouble, there are problems, there are threats, and we have to ask ourselves, how does our faith help us survive in light of these terrible tragedies and disasters? When there are shooting sprees that leave people dead and maimed, or when there are fires that rage uncontrollably, devastating paradise itself, you might say, as is happening in California. How do we look to faith to provide comfort for us in such dark times? I'd like to comment on a couple of things. In the first place, of course, there is the comfort. When bad things happen, for those of us who believe, it is natural to turn to God for comfort and for consolation, and to know that in the valley of death, in the valley of darkness, in the valley of loss, God walks with us, God holds us, God embraces us, and God is there to offer us comfort, so that we do find solace in our beliefs. We do find solace in knowing that God is present even in the devastation, just as God is present to Jesus on the cross, that we are not left alone and abandoned in our suffering, deprivation, and loss. And so comfort then is one of the major ways that faith helps us through the dark times in life. It also gives us hope to move forward, hope to rebuild, hope to redefine ourselves, rebrand ourselves, hope to be flexible enough to recreate ourselves, you might say. So even after the devastating losses, we can rebuild homes, we can rebuild lives, we can look for new careers. It may be we even need to look for new pets and new families, depending what we've lost. But somehow having faith allows us to move forward and not just be stagnant where we are, basically broken by our losses. Now, of course, loss can be very devastating and it can take us a while to recover, but ultimately life calls us forward. And so because we trust and because we believe, then we're able to move forward eventually, when the time is right, to embrace life and to rebuild. And then there's the question of motivation. Once we've survived the tragic loss, once we've survived the dark times, once we have moved beyond our fears and our tears, then we need to ask ourselves, what is the universe calling us to do? And what is God calling us to do in these dark, fragile times? Times have always been dark and fragile, not just in the nuclear age. Even if we go back to the time of Jesus, people lived in terror of the Romans who occupied the country and who at whim could slaughter and massacre, who at whim could coerce people into force them into service. So we have then the constant threat of the Romans. Then there's also the threat of brigands on the path to whatever city you might be traveling to. You're in a caravan of camels and people, and who knows what brigands might come down and destroy and cause slaughter and destruction. So even in the time of Jesus then, life was not safe. Perhaps life has always been fragile. And yet, in fragile times, we're called to have motivation. We're called to rebuild, we're called to dream and envision, and we're called to go forward. We're called to reimagine a new world, a new creation, and to contribute what we can to that. It might mean taking stock of where we are. As a church, for example, we're going through very dark times with all the paedophilia cases and the cover-ups. So how do we rebuild the church so that it really is a vessel of salvation? How do we rebuild the church so that we can once again invite the young to join us in prayer there? So many people have been alienated because of the paedophilia scandals. So many people have left in disgust, shocked by the cover-ups. So how do we rebrand ourselves, reinvent ourselves so that we're relevant, so that we can, in authenticity, speak to the needs of the young and the old alike? So motivation. Again, how can we, in the face of fires and floods and blizzards and all the other kinds of disasters which seem to be caused by climate change, how can we become active in the arena of reducing greenhouse gases, of reducing all the pollution that we create, and of recycling so many of the products that we use in abundance, especially plastic? How can we become advocates for the planet and advocates for those who are suffering from water shortages and from other calamities that have resulted from climate change? Faith then does give us comfort. Faith gives us hope. It allows us to trust, but it also calls us forth into being that new creation who know that our task is nothing less than to recreate the world. So on that happy note, I will leave you and join you again on the 34th Sunday in Ordinary Time. And from then we will go to Advent. So for now I will say goodbye and wish you a blessed week.